was effectively to annul a lot of the teaching that the Lord had given. So Jesus is saying, well, God's actual intention and plan for citizens of the kingdom of heaven is more, not less, than what has been spoken. This has been applied in various matters, in murder, idolatry, divorce, oaths. And now, how do you respond to somebody who does something unjust to you? Let's read together from verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn aside. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you have more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. And may the Lord bless his word to us. Well, this last verse is the principle of where we're going. Perfection. You shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. It is in a sense a prophetic statement. When we come into God's presence as people and become sons of God, then we shall be perfect, just as our Father in heaven is perfect. And we shall live according to the principles that Jesus is laying down in this passage. But now it is a challenge for us that we should behave in this way. But let's go back to verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This comes from Exodus chapter 21. It says that if there's a fight and someone's hurt, then there are 2 outcomes. Sometimes there's lasting harm, and sometimes there is not lasting harm. So you have a time after the fight to see what the outcome is. And if there is lasting harm, verse 23, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Now, this seems to say that the penalty shall match the crime. If the crime has affected a person in one area, then the penalty shall be on the person who caused the harm, the same thing. Now, that can be applied in a very mechanical sense, and that was the way that the Pharisees wanted to apply it. And so they would be applying a very brutal form of judgment. First, we must understand that Moses is setting a limit to the penalty, because the inclination that we have is that if somebody hurts us, we will hurt them back more to tell them not to do it again. But Moses said, no, you shall not punish them more than the harm that they did. So, an eye for an eye, not life for an eye. But let's listen then to what Jesus says. I tell you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. Now, a slap on the cheek is a completely different order of events to gouging out somebody's eye or taking somebody's life. But Jesus is saying, well, you can't apply that principle of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, down to the smallest thing. Somebody slaps you on a cheek, and so you have to slap them back on the cheek also. What Jesus says is, allow them to have a go at the other one. If someone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And if anyone compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. Well, I guess this last verse, verse 42, is the one that is most challenging to us. But let's get an idea of the principle. What we have is Jesus, in a sense, not contradicting. He's saying the appropriate punishment is eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But we need to be careful in applying that, because there is another way to respond, and that is to respond with mercy and with patience and long-suffering. And when he goes on to the next section where he's talking about you shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy, he completely contradicts that and says, no, you shall love your enemies, because God loves his enemies and you are to be like God. And so that principle leads us to understand what he's saying here. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, then you can hit him back on the right cheek and you are equal, but you're probably going to end up in a fight. Because while the principle is fine, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the actual measurement when you apply it to something like a slap on the cheek is that how can you be sure that your slap is of the right intensity? You will be inclined to slap a little bit harder. And then, of course, it's out of balance the other way. And so they will slap a bit harder and the whole thing will get out of whack, so to speak. If a person sues you and wants to take away your tunic, give him your cloak also. In this way, you have increased the debt that they owe you. And now we have someone makes you go with them for 1 mile, carrying goods or something or other, because maybe they're in a position of power. They compel you. They've got a gun at your ribs or something. Then you say, oh, well, that's all right. I've done what you've asked. Let me carry it to you for another mile. Now, these are small things. They're things of inconvenience. Or maybe if you've lost your tunic and cloak, it may be a little bit more inconvenient. But what Jesus is saying is that this principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth can't be applied in every situation. Rather, we should be thinking about opportunities to do good, that we might have an opportunity to demonstrate the goodness of God. For we are to be like God. Our righteousness is to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Maybe by being generous, we are able to win somebody for the Lord. Whereas if we just turn away, if we retaliate, if we try and pay back, the matter is finished, and there is no opportunity for showing the goodness of God. He goes on to say a little bit more about this. Love your enemies. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. This is the response. This goes back to the Beatitudes, where blessed are you when they revile you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. So, linking those two things up, we can be glad when we are mistreated for Jesus' sake, because we are building up brownie points, as it were, in heaven. Our standard of living for God is such that the world has taken notice of it. And now we are instructed to pray for those who abuse us, who persecute us, who misuse us, spitefully use us is the phrase, so that we might be sons of our Father in heaven. And that's what our goal is. The blessedness in the Beatitudes is that we would be the sons of God, that we would be peacemakers. Now, a peacemaker is one who doesn't retaliate in the battle, but rather responds in a way that will generate peace or would promote peace. And this is what Jesus is asking us to do. Because there's no merit in just loving those who love you. Anyone will do that. Everyone kind of responds nicely to those that they think they can get an advantage out of. But we are called to be like God, to love all men, to do good to all men, especially the household of faith, but all men, Paul says. Be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect.